Well, hello, I am here with Gregg Henriques, Dr. Gregg Henriques
Yeah.
of the Unified Theory of Knowledge. And we are here to talk about something that's interesting to me, which is the interrelation and correlation between, for one thing, between Gregg's system and John Vervaeke's 4 P's of knowledge and the 4E cognitive science, and also Daniel Kahneman's work, the so-called System 1, System 2, thinking fast and slow. So about, what was it, 2-3 months ago, Gregg and John put out a paper reinterpreting Daniel Kahneman's work in terms of not only this System 1 and System 2 as Kahneman had it, but also incorporating the so-called Type 1 and Type 2 that I think other psychologists have come up with. So essentially, as I understand it, you and John now think are arguing that there is both a System 1 and a System 2, and within each of those, there's a Type 1 and a Type 2. And let me see if I can remember how it works. And also for this, I kind of have to recognize this. In trying to smooth out the Kahneman system, you're changing the way he would have had it a little bit. So we're going away from that a little bit because I think that you guys found some inconsistencies in that system. So what you now have, as I understand it, okay, so System 1 is involves judgment and probably a combination of feeling and thinking that is pre-propositional. Like you aren't yet coming up with thoughts in mind that are propositional. System 2 is propositional. So that's the, within John's 4 P's of knowing, he has perspectival, participatory, procedural, and propositional. So 3 of those 4 P's are System 1, and only propositional is System 2, as I understand it.
That's right. There's a lot of qualifications I'll be giving here, but you're basically, all the boxes are being placed in the right order.
Okay. And then also with the untangling the world knot of consciousness, you guys did that several hour series, and there's other sub series that you've done with John and with other guests in the last 2 years. But that one in particular, I think it was just you and him.
That was our first, and that's
yes. And so you guys were trying to figure out the correlations between you talk and John's 4 P's of knowing and 4E cognitive science, and also bringing in other theories of consciousness and such as global workspace and IIT. But then within that, you guys did actually touch on the correlation between the 4 P's of knowing and the map of mind, wherein the map of mind, you have, in just a moment here, there's some the best illustration that you have several of these illustrations, but there's one in particular that I appreciate, where it makes clear what 1 is, what 2 is, and what 3 is. Although you maybe could just say that kind of out of memory here. If not, I might just refresh.
I do have access to what those are. Yes.
Yeah. Let me see if I can bring it up right here. This image, just so we can properly frame what we're talking about. All right, so map of mind 1, 2, 3 gives a clear descriptive metaphysical map of mental process as 1, neurocognition, 2, subjective conscious experience, and 3, self-conscious justification narratives that are then differentiated by the epistemological vantage point of being either exterior behavioral or interior phenomenological. So exterior behavioral is B, and interior phenomenological is A within that system, as I think that's what we're talking.
Sort of, because but not for mind 1A.
Okay.
So not quite. A and B is more just the B happens to correspond to behavior, but it's more like 1, 2, A, but it's already mind 1, 2, 3, and then it's now A versus B. But yeah, no, mind 1 refers to neurocognitive behavior, basically. And what we mean, and that's both inside the animal, which is essentially the hierarchical neuroinformation computational structure that affords the capacity for it to be a complex adaptive system that engages in sensory motor looping, that enables it to, that you watch, observe through its activity, demonstrate functional awareness and responsivity to its environment. Okay.
Okay.
So that's what whenever you watch an animal, you're watching mind 1B, that's doing activity. So if you're watching bees pollinate a flower, that's mind 1B. Okay. We can then study the neurocognitive architecture, okay, of that in terms of saying, hey, there's transduction. It's got a nervous system. Transduction is the way the nervous system picks up changes in the either exterior environment or interior environment. And then those changes activate neural patterning. That neural patterning is it's like an information processing language that then maps the animal environment relation. And then we have pretty good maps about how the neuroinformation processing works. And from this vantage point, it's essentially a neurorobot. Okay, meaning that we're basically treating the nervous system here the way you treat a computer computational system, not exactly in the hardware software relation, but in the sense that we're not imputing any particular sentient experience to it. Okay, but we're just demonstrating to say, hey, you could build an electronic robot and it will demonstrate functional awareness and responsivity. We can watch a bee exhibit its functional awareness and responsivity. That's the overt behavior pattern. And then we can study the physiology and its correlation with the behavior. We can get into the neuroscience itself, but there's the computational or cognitive neuroscience. That's the information networking. The neuroscience is the brain-based structure. And then the activity is the overt mental behavior. So overt mental behavior, that's mind 1B. Mind 1A with no phenomenology is just the neurocognitive architecture. Okay. Then you have the question of whether or not there's something that is like to be a bee. Okay. And that is, does the bee have an experience of the world? There's big debate about whether or not a brain that size could generate an experience of the world. For example, everything that we identify as experience as humans requires the interaction of much larger and in some ways more evolutionary recent, that's a debatable term, but a more evolutionary recent frontal cortex, parietal cortex. Okay, so when you have a conscious experience, global neuronal workspace can document that there's an ignition switch basically between your parietal lobe and frontal lobe that essentially turns on your task-oriented network and gives you the perspectival experience of being. So this is a little thing like an apple. Okay, now I see the apple. We can flash apples to you at like 1/100th of a second, you won't see it. Okay, but 300 milliseconds and you will start to see it. And then what's happening there is there's an ignition switch and that corresponds to your conscious experience of being. Question is, well, do bees have the equivalent of that? And how? We don't know the answer to that hardly at all. There's there's good debate. I'm of the belief that, yeah, bees would have some flashes of sentience, pleasure, pain kinds of elements, some sensory experience. How much of that is it's a very, very difficult question to ask about mind 2 for a whole host of reasons. So we can study bees at mind 1. We can wonder about mind 2, and certainly we want to be conscious ourselves about how we know and how we don't know. But that's mind one versus mind two. So then mind two is referring to the perspectival, subjective conscious experience of being that collects itself, for advanced organisms like us at least, into a experiential self, a felt sense of an inner perceiver of the world. I certainly think there's good evidence that birds and mammals, probably octopuses and maybe bees, have this kind of experience. So that's mind
okay. Well,
two.
let me look at mind 1A. So that seems to me okay. So the nuts and bolts of that, you're explaining, I think, your behavioral investments theory, and the influence matrix explains some of that, and then also that seems like, okay, participatory knowing as well. So it's pre-reflective, it's engagement in the agent to reader relationship, especially insofar as you're reacting to novel conditions in your environment. You have that interrelation, so, but if as soon as it's something that you can have an episodic memory for, then it's phenomenological. As soon as it's something you can reflect on. So to say, though, that there isn't that inner experience, I think there is a lot going on that just you do have that first person experience, but if you don't remember it, so that's where I think there is a little bit of a blurry line between the 1A. I wouldn't define it entirely in terms of just neurocognition. It is that what is happening there, I guess, it's difficult to understand because it is, it's not something you can introspect on and really understand what's happening, but it is happening. You do have, I think, just that participatory experience, but that it's not something you really you don't remember it. You don't.
Okay. Well, there's two
feel
different
yourself
issues. Right.
doing it unless you have that reflection.
Sure.
So that's what I'm basically getting at, and that's what I think a bee would experience.
We have no idea
remember,
what a bee experiences.
and
we have no idea what a bee experiences, so we just don't know.
Sure. I think what I mean, though, is that there might be correlates between our what's happening deep in our psyches, and probably not a bee, but something like a reptile.
Right. I mean, so the way the way you talk constructs this essentially is it's basically says the evolution of mind two, following the neurocognitive architecture, evolution of mind two gives rise to an initial likely sensory affective flash of experience, which corresponds to our sensory, what in a memory system you can call it sensory memory, working memory, long-term memory. Your sensory memory lasts about 0.3 of a second to 3 seconds. It's what's essentially on the desktop of your consciousness in the moment. The argument would be that this does evolve first. There's huge questions and many indirect sets of answers as to whether or not something like that lives in a bee. We have no idea whether or not it is something like to be a bee. That at the same time, we can learn a huge amount about what a bee can sense in the functional neurocognitive sense. We know that bees communicate with each other. We know that bees find out where the pollen is. They bring it back. They waggle. We know that bees build nests with a huge amount of sophistication. They do all sorts of unbelievable things. How do we know that? We can study them. And we study their functional awareness and responsivity from the outside. I just listened to a whole podcast on the sensory capacities of animals. It's amazing what they can do and what we know that they can do. But if you listen to the podcast, then very quickly, Sean Carroll asked, well, how do we know what they experience from the inside? And it's like, well, that's a totally different question. We can infer, but we are unbelievably ignorant about the first person mind to experience, especially of things that get into brain sizes that have the size of bees. we have pretty good data that things like birds, for example, have first person experience of being. Whether or not fish do is a good debate. I think they do. I think the data is pretty clear. Whether insects do or not, I haven't seen anybody that knows how to decipher whether a bumblebee has a first person experience of being, even though it's unbelievably smart and can do things like cross-modal identification, meaning you can feel something and then you can train it to go determine based on what it feels to what it's pick it out based on vision. So we know that it has functional awareness and responsivity. That's all mind one stuff. We have no idea whether it's mind two.
Okay. So I was mostly interested though in identifying the correlates between this map of mind and the 4 P's of knowing. So
okay.
That mind 1A seems to me participatory for the most part in initial. So I really seems to me that there is a participatory experience that it comes from something, it's because it's pre-reflective, it doesn't lead to these memories. And if you do have these memories, then you're essentially burying that participatory experience. Also, it seems like, okay, so it could be either participatory if it's not scripted, but it's so much of what you're doing in your pre-reflective experience is scripted, and thus it's procedural, so, but I think you have that. You don't have procedures for figuring out everything in life, and you're better off not doing that. I think that's one of the John's main theses is that, you'd be better off not being so rigid in your life experience, so, but inevitably you have that, mixture of scripted or not scripted in your core ground of being there, some of which you have as episodic memories, and that, more detailed phenomenological experience. But I really think that there is a phenomenological experience below that you just don't really remember very much when you're reflecting on it. So that's kind of what I'm seeing here with the mind 1A versus the mind 2.
The we got to be clear about the context in which we're talking. Okay, so John generates the 4 P's for human beings. Okay, so we're, John's primary and his emphasis essentially is we have the modernist period has grossly exaggerated propositional knowing, and his emphasis is that there are a lot of other kinds of knowing that humans engage in. Okay, and so then he's messaging to us, wait a minute, that we can create a taxonomy of the way humans know. And one of the categories is proposition, explicit knowing that. But there's a lot of ways that humans know about the world. And he identifies procedures and participatory and perspectival. And John is a human cognitive scientist. That doesn't mean he doesn't pay attention to animals. I'm a human clinical psychologist. But he's not thinking about that initially, I don't think, in relationship to, okay, well, what does this mean about the animal kingdom? Now, when John and I get together, okay, and then have our different perspectives on the world, then we're fitting his 4E cognitive science view and recursive relevance realization model for neuroinformation processing, which includes phenomenology and self-recursive justificatory processes inside of that. Then we start syncing up, and it's like, well, hey, let's put our models together and see how it works. I had tracked the evolution of cognition. And it then is pretty clear when you do that the first line of emergent cognition are procedural reflexes. Okay, so the first thing you get is a procedural withdrawal reflex, for example. Okay, and the first kind of learning you get are habituation and sensitization structures, where basically the system is learning whether or not it should increase its sensitivity to this response and pull away, because that's a toxin, they're going to need to learn from that, or decrease its sensitivity and not worry about it, adapt and habituate. Okay. So the procedural system is essentially a stimulus reflex system that then can be adjusted slightly based on habituation, sensitization, and other associative matrix notions. Okay. And so then when I'm looking at John's taxonomy, all right, I could say, oh, the line of procedural knowing can come down to the procedural reflex system. And indeed, inside of our entire neurocognitive architecture, there's clearly a procedural learning system. That's different than the episodic and the verbal semantic learning systems. Okay, they're different knowledge and memory systems. So I can say, hey, John, your root of procedural knowing in humans is this procedural habit system. Fair? He's like, oh yeah, totally fair. But when I say procedural habit system, that is not exactly what John means by procedural knowing. Okay, so we need to be clear that those things now don't become, those are different reference. They line up theoretically, so you can now create a coherent line, but the referent is different in the sense that John can certainly mean, oh, that surgeon knows how to perform that heart surgery. And mostly what they've done in the heart surgery is generate proceduralized knowing to generate skill and demonstrate power control under specific situational constraints. Okay, so they need to know, then do this, do this, do this, do this. So a heart surgeon obviously is being unbelievably reflective, engaged in total type 2, system 2 processes, we can get to that, but is now engaged in systematic procedural knowing, which by John simply means, well, the linear application of algorithmic rules that confers a skill and generates power. Okay.
That's where the confusion lies a little bit for me, because I thought what John meant by the procedural knowing was kind of more muscle memory. Although I can understand, okay, so if I'm able to recount a procedure and say, well, this is how you do it. Well, that seems actually a little more propositional, huh? Right?
Well, you can do, I mean, they certainly overlap some, but if you're doing long division and you say, apply this algorithm for long division, yes, there's a propositional idea element to that, but actually, and they can overlap. You're being basically engaged in procedural knowing the way John is framing it in this context, this knowledge of recipe, knowledge of sequence. Now, it relates to the way the nervous system then operates early on. The first ground of what it builds off of is procedural, and procedural muscle memory is automatized and pretty unconscious. Now, whether or not that's unconscious in what sense, that gets interesting, but we all know, I presume, have the experience of you're learning something where you have to be very conscious, like tie your shoes. It is a set of sequence. When you first encounter it, you don't know what the hell you're doing. And every step then has to be learned, but then you download the muscle memory into the sequence, and now you can tie your shoes without being conscious of it at all. We can debate whether or not we actually have to see your shoes and feel your shoelaces at one level, but certainly many different times I put on my shoes and all I do is, oh, I need to go put on my shoes. And the next thing I know, I'm walking. And if you ask me, how did I put my shoes on? I'm no fucking, it happened. I just delivered. I offloaded the procedural knowing system, and neuroscientists and neuropsychologists found through memory injury that procedural system can be learned, can be built, operates completely different to what they call the declarative, more reflective conscious memory systems that are episodic and semantic. So these are now in your memory systems. And again, when you shift over to the angle of systems, you're going to elaborate different features of it. And so you really need a pretty good refinement in knowing whether you're in the context, say, of behavioral investment theory that's talking about the evolution of nervous systems, John's context where he's saying, hey, listen, folks, there's a lot of different ways of knowing we need to embrace. And he's bringing really attention to participatory knowing as a particular kind of knowing that's kind of novel. And it's a very actually broad kind of knowing. And it took me a little while to really jive, because of all the types of knowing, it's the most diffuse and unclear, and it doesn't necessarily fit really into the pretty clearly delineated, at least knowledge memory systems of procedural, episodic, and verbal semantic.
Suppose so, but then I think that, a few minutes ago, you said that there's a sensory knowing, which is, fleeting And also the fact that you would have to learn these procedures. How are you doing that? You know, you don't have a procedure for learning procedures. Ultimately, it's not procedures all the way down, right? So somewhere down the line at the ground, it is that agent arena relationship.
Right.
So
right.
that's
so participatory.
Yeah.
And then the argument that I would make is this. Basically, you get pretty simple approach avoidance systems that are controlling behavior, and they're grounded in reflex. And you see this in like planaria worms. Prior to that, you get jellyfish and sponges. Then in the Cambrian explosion, we see a pretty quick evolution from bilateral worm-like things that are probably just feeding off of plants into much more complicated segmented bodies and controlled brain systems in the Cambrian explosion. And you get the major categories of the large animals' bodies basically emerging. That's going to then set the stage for the evolution of all birds and mammals, etc. With this, essentially, you go from planaria worms, like say you go to lobsters or crabs, okay? And you do it in a very short period of time. My argument would be that lobsters and crabs come prepared with a lot more participatory learning, okay, readiness. And the reason ultimately is because what I believe happened, and there's a lot of good evidence for this, is essentially what you get is prey-predation relations, okay, in the evolution of the Cambrian explosion. So all of a sudden, instead of eating plants, which just stay there are prey and predators that start eating other animals, and they run and hide and develop defenses. And now you have an agent versus agent arena relation. And it's participating as a prey or a predator, and then mating relative to other things that are moving around and connecting. Those kinds of systems then basically require a behavioral investment, recursive relevance realization, agent arena relation that's a lot more dynamic, iterative, and then you have to get into this sort of participatory operant conditioning, operant meaning you're shaped by the consequences that you engage in, and it evolves your consequential capacities. So that's the argument, is that first there's procedural reflexive, then there's operant experiential, and that's pretty participatory, okay? We would also presume, or I would presume, that there is some perspectival emergence at this juncture at a flash level, which would then be relating to mind two in my definition and perspectival knowing. But that's again, that then brings in the whole question of subjective experience of being, which is always a very complicated set of questions. And you have to know from my vantage point whether you're anchoring your stuff to what you are tracking behaviorally or whether you're inferring what a subjective experience is. That's basically, are you talking the language of mind one versus language of mind two?
I suppose so. Yeah, I still, it seems to me that when we talk about subjective experience, it's easier to recount the perspectival and much more difficult to recount the participatory, where you weren't building up these episodic memories, but that's still, I think there's a subjective experience to that. Thus, it makes it much easier for me to get to some form of panpsychism, at least insofar as we have the animal kingdom. So with that nervous system, anything that has this, behavioral investment systems and influence matrix, there is something there. And it's just, we end up, when we're introspecting, we end up kind of bracketing out that, the more circumspective participatory knowing. So we're trying too hard to, like, what is it like to be that? And it's difficult. We don't really have those sort of memories because it doesn't work that way. That doesn't mean, though, that if we're in this flow state and we're not really building up those sort of episodic memories, that there is no experience. There is an experience there.
Well, of course, virtually, obviously, all humans are having a global emotional workspace that's engaged in a CAS-focused network that's bringing quick flashes of events that's 0.3 of a second that don't get translated into working memory that then dissipate. But that's an online system that's required. We can decide whether or not that's conscious, but that's not the issue of what we're talking about.
Seems like that's, well, that was that I think, though, that Mind 1A, that does have that sort of phenomenological element. It's just a different kind of phenomenological element than the perspectival, and it's something that
of mind
you
one.
can have more Well, it's not as you would define it. Then it's like, maybe you would say it's a mind 1C, because it's not something that you already have in your system. I'm just saying that there's a different side of things there that perhaps isn't accounted for in your map of mind. Or it's a deeper.
If there's a flash of subjective experience, the emergence of the flash is the beginning of mind 2. That's it. So certainly that would be the definite. What we talked about in John's thing is valence qualia. There's flashes of pleasure and pain at 0.3 of a second. And then now, okay, that would be mind 2. That is the merging epistemological portal of what it is like to have subjective conscious experience of being. That's the definition of mind 2. Obviously, mind 2 is it's essentially always operative in human beings when they're awake. If you didn't have a task-oriented consciousness system that was taking flashes of what was going on and affording your attention that structure, you wouldn't be able to function. Now, whether that's flashing in bumblebees, so we got to keep talking about, what are we talking about here in relationship to? Are we talking about consciousness in terms of the sensory experience from the inside? Are we talking about functional awareness and responsivity? Are we talking about inferring consciousness? Certainly this entire conversation, I'm tracking at a mind 2 level in relation. Sure.
But you just a moment ago said while you're awake. So there is a certain experience while you're asleep as well. It's just not the same kind as what we have when we're awake. That's
your mind 2 mostly goes offline when you're asleep. Certainly you can then wonder, that's at a gross consciousness level. My mind 2 goes offline and then flickers back and forth when I dream. It's gross consciousness.
You just don't remember it.
Well, there's certainly then different questions in relationship to whether or not you have to have, in order to have reporting on elements, there's both the experience and then conscious access. Conscious access is the holding and storing of that particular structure. So yeah, you could certainly then say, I'm totally experiencing the world completely. It's just that I have no memory of that. So you can, the line between, we're pretty clear, like when you get anesthesia, it's almost certainly not the case that you're experiencing the structure. It's pretty clear that the light goes out. Certainly when you sleep, obviously, because you dream and other things, mind 2 is flickering on quite a bit, largely goes out. And there's an iterative relationship between what's on the screen for a very short period of time, what goes into working memory, and then it goes into long-term potentiation. Anything that you have conscious access to that you can report on is either in working memory or long-term potentiation. So yes, there's an iterative relationship between memory and mind 2, certainly, in terms of what we can say is there. In other words, if you can report on it, it's getting into memory. If you can't report on it, then it may be the fact that it was there but wasn't stored in memory. Sure, it's a 2-step process called, Ned Block identifies this in relation to conscious access.
Okay. All right, that's okay, so what we didn't get to quite yet so much is the mind 3, and that's the I think as you were saying that this these like 2 transcends and includes 1, and 3 transcends and includes 2 and 1. So this is your propositional knowing, your ability to engage in these justification systems.
Yeah, it's essentially the novel frame of the medium of mind 3 is language, okay, and the meaning-making structures are language or propositions. The dynamics around meaning-making structures are questions, meaning that you get question-answer or proposition-question dynamics that give rise to iterative language, systems. That's the medium of it. The way you know is through the collection of propositions in this context. So this corresponds to John's propositional knowing. And so mind 3 then is an intersubjective self-recursion awareness function, aka the ego, and persona, whereby what's happening here is I have a mind 2 experience embedded in mind 1, and recursively on that, I have both conscious experience and access to them and self-recursive capacities to narrate on those and share them with you. It says, hey, I've got a moon behind me and it looks kind of like this. It actually looks purple over here, but it comes up on the screen when I look at it, it's more white. Okay. The purple I see, the white that I see, that's all mind 2. The propositional networks that I'm reflecting on and can share with you, that looks white, that looks pink. Those are all mind three propositional networks that live in the space of justification, which I identify as sort of the culture person plane of existence.
All right. And to finally get then to Kahneman's system, in the system 1, system 2, as opposed to the type 1, type 2. As Kahneman is saying in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he gives some examples of, coming to snap judgments on the basis of some sort. They give you kind of mental tricks about like the bat and the ball and stuff.
Yep.
And he gives that example of like, okay, how much does the bat and the ball cost, or something like that, and because that's a propositional thinking, that where people often come to the wrong answer. You said that is not system 1, because it's propositional, it's system 2. But that then you and John said, okay, there's this fundamental thing that's happening within system 1, within system 2, which is okay, is it a snap judgment? Then it's type 1. Is it something that you're having this recursive relevance realization? Then it's type 2, I think.
Right. So the issue is, you got to understand the case that John and I are making, you have to understand the history of dual processing in psychology. So all of this is dual processing. What do you mean by dual processing? Since Freud, at least, and really before Freud, people have divided human cognitive process, psyche process, into at least 2 different systems. Okay. Freud talked about primary process, like there's an immediate reaction to something, and then there's secondary process. You're reflective about it. Okay. So there is a pantheon of taxonomies. Some of them also have 3. Most of them, by the way, who have 3 have an underlying procedural reflexive system they put underneath this. Okay. So there's an entire line of thought in psychology called dual process models. Okay. And there are many, many different aspects and facets of dual processing. On the list when this came up, I sent you another famous one that's more in the clinical realm, cognitive experiential self theory, put out by Epstein. Okay. And then you look at the history of the terminology, and there's been all sorts of debate as to whether or not, hey, should we call these type 1 and type 2 processes? There's system 1, system 2. There's a wide primary and secondary process. There are all these different variants of it. And the dual processing literature has said, well, yeah, there are lots of different schools of thought and lots of different angles on this. There's a general element. And Kahneman's a decision-making theorist, okay, and a cognitive. So he comes in and he grabs the language of system 1 and system 2, even though he goes ahead and then tells you he doesn't really mean it like a system. That's a metaphor. Don't think of these. And then he tells you there's 2 personalities inside your system. So he's actually very inconsistent. Okay. From if you take a me and John perspective and you put them together, what immediately pops. Okay. So then all I'm saying is there's a big debate inside the literature. Is it type 1, type 2? If you mean it as type 1, type 2, it means one thing. If you mean it as system 1, system 2, it means another. Blah, blah, blah. And then they're back and forth. And that's where Kahneman is. I think it's a 2011 book. At the time, that's when he's writing. And then he takes this as the system 1, system 2, thinking fast, thinking slow. The thinking fast is an immediate reaction to something. Okay. Then thinking slow is when you stop and recursively analyze it. Okay. And he emphasizes that, yeah, there's also these 2 kind of personalities inside your structure. Okay. So he doesn't mean them as a system, and then he blends them. All I say is that from a UTalk perspective, I'll say 6 million ways from Sunday, we should think about humans as having 2 minds. Okay. There is an animal primate mind. Okay. That goes down all the way from animals at the Cambrian explosion into vertebrates, into mammals, into primates. That line, that's your first mind. Okay. And then on top of that mind, that's mind 1 and 2, by the way. On top of that mind is a second mind, okay, that gets added. It gets the socialized mind. It's added through propositional socialization onto the culture person plane of existence. So then you look at the human structure and you're like, is that a reasonable map? Well, UTalk says that's one way to interpret dual process. very consistent with like Epstein's model. And it basically says you have an animal structure that's doing one kind of mental process, and you have a human structure that's doing a second. What I want to say is that's the best way to describe that is that's system one. Okay. That's a system. Now, inside system one, there's type 1 and type 2 process, because now we go to John. John's relevance realization is actually, I really try to encourage him, it's recursive relevance realization, because the entire process is an iterative agent and reader process where the essence of it is you scan for relevant information. You then look to realize both make sense out of and make happen. So now you create the dynamic edge of the organism agent arena. And then you hierarchically, recursively operate on it. Okay, that's the essence of it. That's what animals do. Okay, so it's a general cognitive model, goes right down. What I said to John is like, listen, John, when I'm looking at this, you look at the type people who say, hey, like Stanovich, he says, hey, the much better word is type. And you look at the way, and actually most of what Kahneman's talking about, he's really talking about types process in his research. The type distinction is your recursion. In other words, type 2 is when you're engaged in recursive, reflective thought, which animals do, on what the immediate impulse is. So the argument then is that's type 1, type 2. When I generated justification systems theory, I pulled the human mind and the cultural socialization process mediated by linguistic propositions off of the animal mind, which is doing nonverbal, perspectival, participatory, procedural, recursive relevance realization. So now you then say, oh, you look back at dual processing models and you realize no wonder they were talking types and systems. They were all confused because some people were identifying like Epstein, the animal and really Freud primary process versus an egoic secondary process that could reflect. Other people were saying, hey, you make an impulse and then you recursively analyze, check on that impulse with working memory to determine whether the initial impulse is correct. You recursively check it. Type 2 is the recursive checking. If you apply that lens to the way in which people think, and then Kahneman's example fits right in. It says, oh yeah, it's a system 2 justificatory, at least now if we apply Henriques' model, it's a justificatory proposition, but it's all justifications initially, well, as you learn how to do them, they get embedded in proposition and procedural structure so that you habituate them all, and you have immediate flashes. That's recursive relevance realization. I immediately take what's salient and jump to a conclusion, and then I recursively do it. So when I say the bat and ball example, that is a type 1 process, jump to conclusion, mediated by propositional knowing, and then regulated then in the thing that's connected to the person justificatory network. So that's what I'm saying, is that people have overlooked the very good rationale, if John and my systems come together, that we can use John's system to differentiate types and use the UTOX framework of mind, animal, and culture person to differentiate systems. You put those two together and you realize, holy shit, no wonder he was having trouble seeing the systems, because he collapsed a 2x2 into just 2. And that's what has been a problem with a lot of dual processes. They're trying to collapse a 2x2, and I mean a 2 into what we were able to then see through our shared work is actually a 2x2 dichotomy, or chi-square or whatever, or 2x2 table. And when you get that, now all of a sudden the issue is that's a totally different taxonomy for dual processing. It's quad processing. I mean, in 4 categories. So now type 1 and type system 1 are not equivalent. They're fundamentally different reference. So system 1 is the animal referent, and system 2 is the human egoic referent. And then type 1 is relevance realization. Type 2 is recursion and analysis on the initial conclusion. You take that stuff, and then I think you immediately make an advance on the incredible confusion that's been in dual processing literature. That was the point of the blog.
All right. Well, that makes a lot more sense now. And I can say that what led me to want to explore this is to figure out how we can improve different kinds of thinking. And what I was seeing in exploring this ecosystem and this greater liminal movement is that some of these psychotechnologies, practitioners, organizations, they seem to be specializing in improving our capacity for certain kinds or types or systems of thinking. And if we could have a directory for that, that would actually be kind of good, because we need to improve ourselves in each of these areas. We have different psychotechnologies. This is kind of what I'm seeing, is that there isn't any one single answer for how we can be not only have more inner awareness and inner peace, but also develop, our socio-cultural framework better to address our greater challenges.
Totally.
So we need to look at, okay, what practitioners, what psychotechnologies, what ecologies of practice can we bring in to address this problem here of this type, as needed, and find, and also we need to work, I think, on a broad spectrum of these. So this is kind of what I was looking at. Some of this came about at the Emerge gathering when we had a breakout session about integral and the history of integral, and how there's this beautiful map, the Aqua model, right? Which not everybody is fully on board with, but I think that you can kind of take kind of a simplified version of it. It doesn't have to involve all the, we're going to keep trying to grow to higher levels above, there's second tier, third tier, and all. Yeah. So you don't have to think of things that way. You don't have to think of things quite that way, but it's actually a lot of it, I think, if you kind of just lob off kind of the speculative stuff, a lot of it does line up pretty well. And then someone in this breakout session said, okay, so I'm really interested in Vervaeke's work, but there isn't a map for it. Mm-hmm. And it's a little hard for me to understand what he's talking about. And then some of us wants to see how can we map the Vervaeke's work and also the work of other people, other practitioners, into something similar, a little bit similar to the Aqua model. So what I was kind of thinking, okay, is that looking at these P's of knowing, those each seem to have psychotechnologies around them that can be developed. You can develop your capacity in that regard to help yourself be more recursive in your relevance realization, rather than just going with snap judgments, as many people do, and also being less rigid in your thinking and your behavior patterns. So they're, trying to promote the work. There's already practitioners out there doing excellent work, and we can see if we can show, the more general population that this work is useful, to broaden the audience for that, so there's a big 100% plan that we have in mind here for what we're going to do with this. And I can say that one thing I was thinking was that your map of mind, or something close to it, I guess that we might not be 100% on the same page, but the map of mind with the 1, 2, and 3, and then you left open the possibility that there could actually be a 2A versus a 2B. I remember you saying that at one point. So
yeah, I put that in my book. I've clarified what that opened, that a particular kind of implicit intersubjective space that you can make at least a case for. It's a little tricky at the level of descriptive metaphysics, but I think it works.
But ultimately, that's it. Essentially, if you did that, then I'm seeing how these different kinds of psychotechnologies and different organizations and practitioners seem to line up with that. We have 6 different types then of psychotechnologies, or 6 different metacognitive processes, 6 different lines of development at that point, And they essentially, like in Wilbur speak, you have 3 then in the upper left and 3 in the lower left. So essentially circling, for example. Okay, so that seems to be, if there was a mind 2B, that seems to be, you're getting in that space, you're developing that line.
Sure.
Then.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, the mind 2B space is whenever the argument is whenever you start to develop a relationship with somebody, and then you both develop internal working models of each other, and then you develop a history of relating along those lines, and you can track when you really know somebody, they immediately, like if their mood shifts, you can pick that up, and then you have really sophisticated models, and there's an iterative process. So circling, psychotherapy, intimate relations, all of those are actually then trying to create a participatory dynamic space between people and use our capacity for shared attention, intention. We're very unique in our primate capacities to really track eye movements and a felt sense of intention, attention kinds of structures. And it's really cool. And then if theorists can build some of that, and then you say, well, yeah, we need actually psychotechnologies so that we identify. This is, of course, John's whole point is we grossly exaggerate what we can know propositionally relative to these other domains. We need full-fledged educational experiences and other elements that enable us to cultivate these other aspects of knowing. That's the only way we get around in the world. So we want to expand that. So then, yeah, if you built a taxonomy, you can see practices, feel more whole. That'd be a great extension of all that.
Yeah, definitely. So that's what we're aiming to do. And we are also, this is part of this implementing the Hansi Freinacht vision, because this is what's called the politics of the existential politics. Like you need a framework for that. So I was thinking, okay, it could be essentially a merger of your work, John's work, and sort of Wilbur's work, as I was saying, like kind of a simplified version, because I think he kind of has stuff that's a little too speculative, but that would serve that purpose. And that's what we're aiming to do. We're also aiming to see if we could develop some software around this to help automate it, to connect practitioners to communities that could use these for the inner development, for trust building, et cetera. So we've got some big ideas of what we want to do in the coming months and years to really actually put this into practice and make some positive social impact.
Okay. Well, it's a fascinating idea, and certainly I wish you the best of luck with it.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for Gregg for taking the time to talk to me here.
Absolutely. Yep. Appreciated it. Enjoyed the conversation, and I wish you the best of luck in those endeavors.